Hey everyone, this is our first video. This is on Chapter 9, Middle Eastern and Asian Indian Americans. So this is going to be like a brief lecture of this chapter, and I just want to go do some highlights. Now, this is our first video, our first lecture video, and I'm not going to do like a full lecture like we normally do, like over the span of 2 days in our classes. These are just going to be like really brief, relatively brief summaries of our readings, right? So, this one thing I wanted to note first of all is this is part of the difficulty of this book. We're lumping together Middle Eastern Americans, and also in my version of the book, we're doing Asian Indian Americans as well. This Middle Eastern, particularly, if we talk about it, this area is not monolithic in terms of race, ethnicity, religion, language. It's super multicultural. And everything like that. So that's important to understand. And then we have a few groups that we're going to particularly profile in this chapter. Um, it's interesting how even initially, when many Arab Americans were coming over to the United States, um, they experienced hostility and some violence, um, somewhat. Different for different reasons, right? The majority of Arab Americans who came earliest were actually not the Arab Americans we think of today, particularly with regard to religion. Arab Americans who have immigrated over the last several decades to our country are pretty much Muslim in identity as far as religion. Those that came before generally majority were Christian, right? Um, with regard to Arab Americans in general, about 2 million have come from North Africa and the Middle East, particularly Middle East. The largest concentration we see today are in areas in Michigan, particularly the Detroit metropolitan area. In fact, there's this one city, Dearborn, which has a very large Arab American population. We also have large concentrations in Brooklyn, North Jersey, but pretty much in all 50 states, right? Generally, most Arab Americans are middle class, educated, middle and working class, with strong family ties and cultural ties in the United States. Oftentimes, there's particularly with Iranian Americans. There have been some times where this has been less, but there has been a lot of travel back and forth, and actually dual citizenship as well. But a good number of Arab Americans today are live in metropolitan areas like New York, New Jersey metro area, Detroit, Los Angeles, Washington, and Chicago also have large populations as well. About Overall, most I said are Christian, particularly the earliest immigration. Only about 1/4 of Arab Americans in total are Muslim. The Christians were mostly Lebanese and Syrian, and then Iraqis as well. Um, so, one thing that's interesting with regard to stereotyping some ideas that we as Americans have about Arab Americans is we have seen it in films throughout the years, throughout the decades, not just with 9/11, but even before, the Arabs being portrayed in a stereotypical manner as terrorist, misogynist, some as oil tycoons, big sheikhs that have all this kind of money. Women are constantly oppressed. And so that's very problematic, and we've been conditioned by these stereotypes, and in particular after the World Trade Center bombing in 1993 and after 9/11 attacks, these stereotypes have been heightened, right? And this has led to violent backlash against Arabs in total. So the first groups that we're going to talk about are the Lebanese and Syrian Americans, and at that time, when they started to come to the United States was in pretty much the 1870s. About 100,000 came between 1890 and 1914. And now at this time, this wasn't really Lebanon and Syria as we know it today. This was basically they were citizens of the Ottoman Empire until World War One, and then they were under an English and French mandates, right? So the majority of those that had settled pretty much in Manhattan, Lower East Side, Brooklyn, and also areas of Massachusetts. Oftentimes, they have replaced other immigrants that had left certain ethnic neighborhoods, such as the Irish. The invasion succession phenomenon we talked about in this class before. Um, they have met with some backlash when they were here because they were often used as strike breakers, particularly for Irish who were unionized, right? This led to street brawls and stuff. Initially, they were classified as non-white, which was problematic because this made them ineligible for naturalization. Of course, this was overturned later. Um, but we have generally Lebanese and Syrian Americans integrated very quickly into the United States after some time, after a little bit of time, basically became assimilated into whiteness. In fact, I have a childhood friend who's Lebanese. His parents were Lebanese, and they are pretty much, for all intents and purposes, considered white today. They are Christian. As were many Lebanese and Syrian early immigrations. Today, the character has changed, particularly with Syrian immigration to the United States. That has increased in recent years as refugees and asylum seekers because of the civil war, fleeing the government oppression of Syrians in Syria right now. But by and large, Syrian and Lebanese Americans have had a very easy time assimilating into dominant American society, right? The next group that the book talks about are Egyptian Americans, and the majority of Egyptian Americans in the United States, particularly the earlier immigrants, were Coptic Orthodox Christians, which are a stigmatized minority group in Egypt, right? The majority of Egyptian Americans live today in California, New Jersey, New York, Florida, Texas, and Illinois. For Egyptian Americans, it was very easy for them to assimilate and adjust to dominant American society because of many Egyptian Americans were highly educated, and England was the colonial power, so and exerted large influence over Egypt during the colonial period. So many came already knowing English, right? And interestingly, for Egyptians, there's relatively high rates of exogamy, which, if you remember that term, I hope you do. So they also tended to live in areas, not just ethnic enclaves, although some did, in predominantly Egyptian areas, but not really. Many were kind of spread out, even in the larger metropolitan areas in which they lived. Iraqi Americans, again, the earliest ones were Christian. Different kinds of Iraqi Americans. Some were Arab, some were Chaldean and Assyrians, which were Christians that spoke Aramaic, which was the language of Jesus Christ, right? These are small minorities in Iraq. And so the Chaldeans and Assyrians were earliest arrivals out of Iraq, what's modern day Iraq, right? Chaldeans settled primarily in Detroit, Assyrians in Chicago, and they were pretty much they had tight ethnic communities based on this religious identification. After World War II, this identification as Chaldean, Assyrian, changed. It shifted more towards a pan-Arab identity. They started identifying more as Iraqi and Arab instead of Chaldean or Christian, even though they retained Christianity, of course. In the last several decades, though, the character of the immigration to the United States has changed to more Muslim, right? Oftentimes refugees or asylum seekers from fleeing the repressive regime of Saddam Hussein, right? So many of these arrivals generally live in more established Arab communities, particularly in the Detroit metropolitan area and around Dearborn, Michigan as well. Not particularly, this population did not particularly receive as much hostility as you might expect. Many are not really visible as Iraqi. The overwhelming majority oppose Saddam Hussein, those have come here, but pretty much relatively well integrated in society overall. The next group is Iranian Americans, and it's important to understand Iranian Americans are not Arab. They are predominantly Persian, and they speak a different language, Farsi, although they also will speak Arabic for those that are Muslim will speak Arabic, with religious ceremonies. They do know Arabic. They can read Arabic and speak it. Um, in We had a really interesting relationship with Iran over the years, as you probably may know from other classes. When it was ruled under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, about 50,000 Iranians per year came to the U.S. to study, and many did not return to Iran because of the really repressive regime under the Shah. He was deposed during the Islamic Revolution in the 1970s. However, in the 1970s, more Iranians did come here because they were fleeing the Islamic Revolution. Particularly those that had ties here already with other family members, right? But Iranians were predominantly Muslim, although there's some religious minorities such as Jews, Baha'is, Zoroastrians, and Iranian culture is very rich, particularly in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, in Queens, D.C., Arlington metro area. You'll see large populations of Iranians, Persians, particular. But in fact, about one half of all Iranian Americans live in California, particularly in the greater Los Angeles area. And so that's it for them. As far as Asian Indian Americans, the earliest ones were Sikh males, S-I-K-H. It's a religious group, not Hindu. It's a different religion. They came between 1820 and 1900, not too many. Mostly were males that came as sojourners that worked on the West Coast, particularly in Washington, California. They were very distinctive because of turbans and the long beards that they wear. So they experienced quite a bit of hostility and violence, particularly in the turn of the century. And many were deported, actually, and could not be considered as citizens because of the anti-Indian racism and immigration policies that we had. Even though it was considered Hindu backlash. Sikhs were not Hindu; they were in what is modern day India, but not Hindu, different religion, right? So there's problematic relationship with immigration from India particularly until 1965, during the Immigration Act in 1965 we learned about. Since 2000, in particular, more than about 1 million Indians have arrived, and today, according to the stats in the book, about 3.7 million Indians now live in the United States, in pretty much all 50 states. There's other sections in this chapter talk about assimilation for Arab Americans. Pretty much, you get some stats with regard to home ownership, median U.S. income. Indian Americans, same as well. As far as assimilation into dominant American society, pretty much the most assimilated are Syrian and Lebanese, and also second generation Indian Americans, and particularly those with higher educational levels. You'll see that as well, right? So those are some of the highlights of this chapter. So with regard to many of our lectures that I will be giving, I'm going to be giving just brief lectures. There will be some chapters, particularly when we do Black and African Americans, which will be long. You'll probably see 2 videos from me, but this is going to be the only video for this chapter. And so that's it. Have fun reading, and I will see you virtually in the next clip. Okay, bye.